The rain drummed softly against the glass, blurring the skyline of New York into 1,000 trembling lights. On the corner of Fifth Avenue, a woman in a crimson dress stood motionless, her hand clutching a letter she had sworn never to open. Across the street, a man with silvered hair and restless eyes lingered in the shadows, watching her as though she carried his final breath. Neither belonged to the place where they now stood, yet both were bound by a secret no one could ever discover. The city hummed with its usual chaos, horns and footsteps colliding into an orchestra of impatience. But between them, silence thundered louder than the traffic. She dared not cross. He dared not approach. It wasn't fear that chained them. It was the past, the weight of promises that had already destroyed too much. The world around them was alive, but within them lived a story they had tried to bury. And now, New York had brought them face to face with temptation once more. What happens when two hearts collide against the boundaries of loyalty, vows, and time? What does it mean to love someone you were never meant to hold, never meant to touch? The answers are both cruel and tender. Forbidden love is not about choice. It is about inevitability. It does not ask for permission, nor does it wait for approval. It arrives like lightning, striking where it should not, leaving behind scars that ache even decades later. The woman's name was Evelyn Carter, 62 years old, a widow whose quiet strength had carried her through years of solitude. She had buried her husband with dignity, raised her son into manhood, and worn the face of resilience in front of neighbors and friends. Yet tonight, standing in the wet haze of Manhattan, she felt like the young woman she once was, the one who had once stolen moments in candlelit apartments, who had once whispered secrets in a voice trembling with both joy and guilt. The man, Richard Hayes, now 64, had lived a life decorated with success and regret. A polished attorney, he carried himself with the air of authority, but in his private world, he was haunted by the one truth that had never changed. He had loved Evelyn Carter from the first moment he saw her, and he had never stopped. He had married another, built a family, respected his vows, but his heart had never bowed to reason. It had been more than 30 years since they had last stood this close. More than 30 years since they swore to never see each other again. More than 30 years since Evelyn made him promise that they would both protect their families, no matter how much it cost them. And yet here they were, the promise broken not by words, but by the cruel pull of destiny. As the rain thickened, Evelyn finally moved, her heels clicking against the pavement. She crossed the street, letter still in hand, and for the first time in decades her eyes met Richard's without the shield of distance. His breath caught, hers faltered, and in that suspended moment the city seemed to fade away. The way Evelyn's name fell from his lips was almost too fragile to survive the noise of the city. "Evelyn," Richard whispered, as though saying it would shatter the vow he had carried like a stone inside his chest. She trembled, clutching the damp letter tighter, her throat refusing sound. 30 years of silence collapsed in that one moment, and memories rushed back with merciless clarity. The hotel room with its half-drawn curtains, the late-night walks through Central Park where they pretended to be strangers, the ache in her chest when she chose to marry John Carter, a man who loved her openly instead of Richard, who could only love her in secret. "You shouldn't have come," she said finally, her voice a soft fracture. "I didn't come," he replied, shaking his head. "I was already here, always here." The words cut deep, and Evelyn felt the truth in them. For years, even as she built her marriage, even as she rocked her newborn son in her arms, even as she stood by her husband's coffin, she had felt Richard's presence in the shadows of her heart. But she buried it, because that was what good women did. They buried temptation and built lives on sacrifice. The rain eased into a mist, and Richard stepped closer. His hair was silver now, his face lined, but his eyes, those restless eyes, were the same as when they were young. The sight of them made her knees weaken. "Why now?" she whispered. He gave a broken laugh, the kind that held more sorrow than mirth, "because we've run out of later." The days slipped forward like cautious steps on cracked ice. They began meeting in quiet places, careful of eyes that might recognize them. A library tucked between Broadway and Silence, where the smell of old paper kept them company. A small cafe in Greenwich Village, where the barista knew better than to ask questions. Each meeting was brief, stolen, dangerous, yet intoxicating. For Richard, it was as if time had folded in on itself. The years of courtrooms, conferences, and charity galas meant nothing the moment Evelyn smiled. But Evelyn wrestled with guilt every night she returned to her quiet apartment. Her son Daniel was grown now, a doctor in the city, proud of his mother's resilience. He often said she was his moral compass, and here she was, spinning wildly off course, hiding meetings with the one man she had sworn to erase. Richard's situation was no less precarious. His wife, Margaret, though cold and distant in recent years, still held her place in his life. Their children, a daughter in California and a son running a nonprofit in Harlem, had built their identities around the stability of their parents' marriage. What would they say if they knew the truth, that their father's heart had always belonged to another woman? And then there was the letter. Evelyn had carried it for weeks, unopened. It had arrived without a return address, its envelope thick with the weight of confession. The handwriting was Richard's, but he had never mentioned it, never asked if she'd read it. The thought haunted her. What secrets lay inside? Why had he written it, and why did he send it after all these years? The more they met, the more dangerous their secret became. Friends began to notice Evelyn's sudden absences. Daniel, ever protective of his mother, grew suspicious of the way she avoided questions. Meanwhile, Richard's wife found receipts, unexplained gaps in his schedule, and the faintest trace of perfume that wasn't hers. The walls were closing in, and still, they couldn't stop. Each time Richard touched her hand across a table, Evelyn's resolve unraveled. Each time Evelyn looked into his eyes, Richard forgot the world. They were too old to play games, too old to pretend that they could simply let go again. This time the cost would be devastating, but the desire was relentless. One evening, as twilight poured over the city, Evelyn finally opened the letter. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the pages, her heart thudding like a drum of war. Richard's words spilled across the paper, written with the desperation of a man who had bled for too long in silence. He confessed that he had followed her life from a distance, attending her husband's funeral from afar, standing in the shadows, aching to comfort her. He confessed that every victory of his career felt hollow because she wasn't there to share it. He confessed that he had dreamed again and again of writing this letter, but feared it would destroy her. And most damning of all, he confessed that if she were ever free, if she ever gave him the smallest chance, he would abandon everything just to hold her again. Evelyn pressed the letter against her chest, tears sliding down her cheeks. She knew then what she had always feared. Richard wasn't passing through her life again. He was here to stay. And that was when Daniel, her son, discovered the truth. One rainy night, he followed her after a phone call she had taken in hurried whispers. He watched from across the street as she slipped into the cafe, her face softening in a way he hadn't seen in years. And then Richard appeared. The betrayal struck Daniel like a blade. His father had been gone for less than a decade, and here was his mother, his saintly, dignified mother, meeting in secret with another man. He didn't yet know the history, the 30 years of forbidden longing, but he knew enough. And he felt rage boiling inside him, a rage born of protection, fear, and shame. That night Daniel confronted her. Words were thrown like knives. Evelyn tried to explain, but her son saw only dishonor. "You're destroying everything Dad stood for," he shouted, his voice raw. "You're spitting on his memory." Her heart broke, but she didn't deny the truth. She loved Richard. She had always loved him. The cost of their rekindled passion was finally here. Families would fracture, reputations would burn, and the delicate lives they had built would teeter on the edge of collapse. But still, the love refused to die. The letter was still trembling in Evelyn's hands when she met Richard again 2 nights later. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and rain-soaked coats, and she could hear her own pulse louder than the hum of the conversations around them. Richard watched her with those steady, restless eyes, sensing the storm inside her before she even spoke. "I read it," she whispered, sliding the folded pages onto the table between them. Every word. Richard's jaw tightened, his hands locking together as though he was bracing for judgment. And? Evelyn's throat ached. And it was the truth I both needed and feared. You shouldn't have written it, but I'm glad you did. His shoulders sagged with relief, but the relief was jagged, like glass. He reached across the table, his hand hovering, not daring to touch hers. Do you know how many nights I rewrote that letter in my head? How many mornings I woke up ready to burn it, only to keep it hidden in my drawer? It was my confession, Evelyn, my crime and my prayer. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. It was never a crime to love me, Richard. The crime was everything we did to keep it hidden. They sat in silence then, the weight of decades pressing between them. Outside, New York was alive with hurried footsteps, the endless rushing of people chasing deadlines and trains. But inside the cafe, time seemed to slow. Evelyn's mind traveled back to the first time she met him. She had been 28, engaged to John Carter, a good man from a good family. John was everything her parents had hoped for her: stable, ambitious, deeply devoted. Their wedding date was set, and her dress had already been fitted. And then came Richard Hayes. He was a rising attorney then, brimming with charm, carrying a confidence that seemed impossible to resist. He wasn't assigned to her world. He simply appeared in it during a charity dinner hosted by her employer. She remembered the way he introduced himself, calm but with a spark that made her feel instantly seen. Unlike John, who loved her with the steady devotion of a safe harbor, Richard's gaze was like fire, dangerous, consuming, impossible to look away from. One dance had led to a walk under the city lights. One walk had led to a conversation that spilled into dawn. And within weeks, Evelyn had stepped into a shadowed world where her heart betrayed her vows before they were even spoken at the altar. It hadn't been just passion. That was the part she could never explain to anyone, not even to herself. Richard listened in a way no one else ever had. He saw her not as a future wife, not as a respectable woman, but as Evelyn, the dreamer, the restless soul who longed for more than quiet suburbs and neatly folded lives. But she chose John. She chose duty. She chose the safer path, believing that love built on fire could never last, but love built on loyalty could. And in many ways she was right. Her marriage had been strong. John had loved her without question, and she had grown to love him in return, even if a small corner of her heart always belonged to someone else. Richard, meanwhile, had married Margaret. Evelyn had attended the wedding, invited out of courtesy through mutual acquaintances. She had smiled, clapped, and held her tears inside as Richard placed the ring on another woman's hand. That night she had gone home and pressed her face into her pillow until dawn, promising herself that she would never again allow her heart to be so reckless. And yet the affair had continued in secret, years into both marriages. Hotels under false names, weekend work trips that were really stolen escapes, long letters that never saw the light of day. Until one night, 32 years ago, when Evelyn ended it. Her son Daniel was 2 years old then. John had been away on business, and Richard had come to her apartment, filled with longing, begging her not to walk away. But she had looked into her little boy's crib, watched his tiny chest rising and falling, and she had felt something shift. "I can't do this anymore," she had told Richard, tears breaking her voice. "My son deserves better than a mother who is half here, half somewhere else. My husband deserves better, and maybe your wife does too," Richard had pleaded. He had promised her the world, but she had closed the door, and from that day on, they had never spoken, until now. "Do you regret it?" Evelyn asked softly, her voice pulling him back to the present. Richard blinked, startled. "Regret what?" "Everything. The affair. The choices we made. The lies." His face hardened with thought, then softened with something that looked like pain. "Every day I regret the lies. Every day I regret the nights Margaret cried because I wasn't fully hers. Every day I regret the times I stood in a courtroom, winning cases that felt empty because I couldn't celebrate with you. But do I regret loving you?" He shook his head firmly. "Never. Loving you was the only part of my life that ever felt like the truth." Her breath caught. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She hesitated, her mind racing through decades of choices, memories, nights alone, her husband's funeral, her son's pride in her strength. Finally, she whispered, "I regret the pain we caused. But I don't regret us, because even if I tried, I never stopped loving you." The confession hung between them, raw and dangerous. But outside their private cocoon, the world was tightening its grip. Margaret, Richard's wife, had grown suspicious. She wasn't naive. Decades of marriage had taught her to recognize the subtle signs of distance. She noticed the way Richard's phone lingered in his hand longer than before, the way he smiled at texts he wouldn't share, the way he left the house with a trace of excitement that had nothing to do with work. One evening, she confronted him. "Is there someone else?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. Richard froze, staring at her. The years had carved deep lines in Margaret's face, but her eyes were still fierce. She deserved the truth, but he couldn't give it, not yet. "No," he lied, his voice too steady. "You're imagining things." But Margaret wasn't convinced. Meanwhile, Daniel's anger toward his mother grew colder, sharper. He avoided her calls, visited less often, and when he did, the conversations were strained. Evelyn tried to reach him, tried to explain, but he wouldn't listen. "You spent your whole life teaching me about honor, about loyalty, about keeping our family name strong," he said one night, his jaw tight with resentment. "And now I find you sneaking around with some man. Mom, it's pathetic." "It's not some man," Evelyn whispered. "It's Richard." Daniel's face hardened. "Richard Hayes? The one from—" He stopped, realization dawning, anger igniting. "Oh my God. It's been him all along, hasn't it? Even when Dad was alive. Even—" His voice broke with disgust. "You cheated on Dad." Evelyn's chest caved. "Daniel, please. It was complicated. It was—" "No," he cut her off. "It was betrayal. You betrayed Dad. And you're betraying me." His words sliced through her, leaving her gasping. For the first time, Evelyn realized just how much this forbidden love could cost her, not just her reputation, not just Richard's marriage, but her own son's love. And yet, she couldn't stop. She met Richard again, this time in a quiet hotel room overlooking the Hudson. The city lights shimmered below them, casting the room in a golden glow. For the first time in 30 years, they allowed themselves to cross the line they had drawn. When Richard touched her, it was both a reunion and a wound. When Evelyn kissed him, it was both salvation and damnation. They held each other as if time itself had collapsed, as if they were once again the young dreamers who had first found each other under the New York sky. Afterward, lying in his arms, Evelyn whispered the fear that haunted her. "What if this destroys us? What if it destroys everything?" Richard pressed his lips to her hair. "Then let it, because what we have, what we've always had, was worth being destroyed for." But Evelyn wasn't sure, not anymore. The morning after their night by the Hudson, Evelyn stood at her kitchen window, staring at the city waking below her. Taxis honked impatiently. Couples rushed to catch subways. The air smelled of bagels and rain-soaked concrete. Life went on as though nothing had happened. And yet inside her, everything had changed. Her phone buzzed. A message from Richard. "Meet me tonight. Same cafe, please." She closed her eyes, clutching the phone to her chest. How many times had she wished for such a message in her younger years? How many lonely evenings had she longed for the courage to answer? And now, when she finally had it, she felt the walls of her world trembling, threatening to collapse. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she called Daniel. But the call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. No response. Her son was slipping further away. On the other side of Manhattan, Margaret Hayes sat in her living room, a glass of untouched wine in her hand. She had always been sharp, observant, qualities that had helped her survive a marriage to a man who was never fully hers. She had suspected Richard of affairs before, but over the years she had chosen to look away. What good would it do to fight shadows? But this time was different. He was restless, distracted, and oddly hopeful. Hopeful in a way that frightened her. Affairs usually brought guilt, shame, excuses. This brought something else, something deeper. Margaret decided she would not ignore it. She hired a private investigator, a man discreet enough to blend into New York's chaos, efficient enough to find what she needed. Within a week, she had photographs, Richard and Evelyn in the cafe, their heads close together. Richard brushing a strand of hair from Evelyn's face. The two of them entering the small hotel by the Hudson. Margaret studied the pictures in silence. She wasn't surprised. It was almost a relief to see her suspicions confirmed, but what shocked her was the woman's face, Evelyn Carter. Margaret knew her. Not well, but enough. Evelyn had once been part of their wider social circle decades ago. They had shared polite smiles at dinners, exchanged small talk at fundraisers. Margaret remembered her as the quiet, graceful wife of John Carter. She had never imagined, never wanted to imagine, that Evelyn was the woman who had lived in her husband's shadow for all these years. Margaret's hand tightened around the glass, her knuckles white. This wasn't just an affair. This was a ghost from the past, resurrected to humiliate her all over again. Meanwhile, Daniel's anger refused to rest. For days he tried to ignore the images burned into his memory, his mother smiling at a man who wasn't his father, her eyes soft in a way he thought she had reserved only for family. He told himself he would let it go, that it wasn't his place. But the betrayal gnawed at him, louder with each passing day. Finally, Daniel did something reckless. He found Richard. It wasn't difficult. Richard was a public figure, his law firm's office towering over Park Avenue. Daniel waited outside one evening, his heart pounding, until he saw the man emerge. Richard's hair gleamed silver under the streetlights, his suit immaculate. He walked with the confidence of someone who belonged in the city, someone untouchable. But Daniel saw only the man who had stolen his mother's dignity. "Richard Hayes," Daniel called out, stepping into his path. Richard turned, startled. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes?" Daniel's fists clenched. "You don't know me, but you know my mother, Evelyn Carter." The recognition on Richard's face was immediate, and it was damning. "I don't know what you think," Richard began. "Don't lie to me," Daniel snapped, his voice sharp as broken glass. "I've seen you with her. I know what you're doing, and I'm telling you now. You will leave her alone." Richard straightened, his lawyer's composure snapping into place. "You're Daniel," he said calmly. "Your mother spoke of you often." "Don't you dare talk about my mother," Daniel growled. "She gave her life to my father, to me, to this family, and you're dragging her into the dirt. I won't let you." For a moment, Richard almost admired the young man's fury. Daniel reminded him of Evelyn, fire behind his restraint, but admiration didn't soften the truth. "You're wrong," Richard said quietly. "I didn't drag her anywhere. We found each other again because we were never lost." Daniel's eyes burned with disgust. "You make it sound noble. It's not. It's pathetic. And if you cared about her, you'd walk away." Richard's voice hardened. "And if you knew your mother's heart, you'd realize she deserves to choose her own happiness, even if it doesn't fit the story you've written for her." Daniel's fists tightened at his sides. For one wild second he thought about hitting the man, but instead he turned on his heel and walked away, his body trembling with rage. Richard exhaled, shaken. He knew then that this wasn't just about two people finding each other again. The battle for Evelyn's heart would pull everyone they loved into the fire. That same night, Evelyn opened her apartment door to find Margaret Hayes standing there. The sight nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. Margaret, elegant in a navy coat, her eyes sharp as knives, looked at her with a calm fury Evelyn had never seen before. "May I come in?" Margaret asked. It wasn't a request. Evelyn stepped aside, her hands trembling. They sat in the living room, the city glowing faintly through the window. Evelyn felt suddenly small, as though she were the younger woman again, caught in a sin she could never explain. "I know," Margaret said simply, setting the photographs on the coffee table. Evelyn's stomach twisted. The images stared back at her, undeniable. "I knew it years ago," Margaret continued, her voice cold but steady. "I knew there was someone else. I just never wanted to admit it, but now," she tapped the photographs, "now I have the proof, and I have to ask you, why? Why him? Why still him?" Evelyn's throat closed. For years she had prepared speeches for this moment, rehearsed justifications she might never give. But now, sitting across from the woman whose life she had damaged, words felt useless. "Because he was the love of my life," Evelyn whispered, "and he always will be." Margaret's eyes glistened, but she refused to let the tears fall. "Do you know what it's like to live with a ghost in your marriage? To feel his body next to yours at night and know his soul is somewhere else? I gave him everything. I gave him children, a home, a name. And still it was never enough, because of you." Evelyn bowed her head. "I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," Margaret said sharply. "And now you're hurting your son. Do you even realize that? He came to me. He's angry. He feels betrayed. And you know what? He has every right to." Evelyn's heart cracked. Daniel had gone to Margaret. The shame was unbearable. Margaret rose, her composure steel. "I will not let you destroy what's left of my marriage, or my family. End it, Evelyn. End it now, or I will." And with that, she was gone. Evelyn sat in silence long after Margaret left, the photographs burning into her eyes, the weight of it all pressed down. Daniel's fury, Margaret's ultimatum, Richard's relentless love. She felt like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, the city below her waiting to swallow her whole. Her phone buzzed again. A new message from Richard. "I can't lose you. Tell me where to meet you." Her hand shook. She wanted to answer. She wanted to run into his arms and never look back. But another part of her wanted to burn the phone, to erase every trace of what they had reignited. She typed 3 words, deleted them, typed again, stopped. Finally, she let the phone fall from her hand, tears spilling freely. For the first time since Richard had returned, she didn't know what to do. But the choice would soon be taken from her, because secrets never stayed buried in New York, not for long. And the one secret Evelyn had kept even from Richard, the truth about what had really happened the night she ended their affair 32 years ago, was about to rise again, threatening not just their love, but their entire families. The night was restless. Evelyn sat awake, the letter still unfolded on her lap, the city humming below her. Her apartment felt like a cage, every shadow whispering her failures. She replayed Margaret's words over and over. "End it, or I will." But it wasn't Margaret's fury that kept her trembling. It was the memory of another night, 32 years ago, the night she ended things with Richard. The night she carried a secret she had buried so deeply that not even he knew it existed. She rose from the couch, crossed to her bedroom, and opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. Beneath layers of old scarves and forgotten trinkets lay a small box. Her hands hesitated before lifting it, as though it were laced with fire. Inside were photographs, faded and creased, a hospital bracelet, a letter she had never sent. Her tears blurred the objects, but the truth was sharp, undeniable. No matter how many years passed, she could never forget the child she had lost. The child who was not John Carter's, but Richard's. The memory consumed her. She had discovered the pregnancy just weeks before she broke things off with Richard. She had never told him, terrified of what it would mean for her marriage, for his, for their families. She had convinced herself that silence was the kinder path. But fate had made the decision for her. Complications, an emergency at the hospital, and the child was gone before she could even hold him. She remembered lying in that sterile room, John by her side, believing the baby had been his. Richard never knew, and she had lived with that silence ever since. The next evening, Evelyn met Richard again. They chose a quiet bench in Central Park, the trees swaying gently above them, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. Richard took her hand, his warmth steady against her trembling fingers. "You've been distant," he said softly, "ever since Margaret came to you." Evelyn closed her eyes. "Richard, there's something I never told you. Something from years ago." His brows furrowed. "What is it?" She drew a shuddering breath. "Do you remember the night I ended things? When I told you I couldn't go on?" He nodded slowly. "I remember everything about that night." Her voice broke. "I was pregnant, Richard, with your child." The words seemed to freeze the air around them. Richard stared at her, unblinking, as though the world had tilted beneath him. "But how?" His voice cracked. "What happened?" "I lost the baby," Evelyn whispered, tears streaming freely now. "Complications. I never even got to hold him. John thought the baby was his. I let him believe it. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell anyone." Richard's face crumpled. He rose from the bench, pacing, his hands pressed against his head. "My God, all these years I thought the worst thing I'd lost was you, but I lost my child too, and I didn't even know." Evelyn wept silently, her heart tearing open. "I thought I was protecting everyone, protecting you, But now, I wonder if I was only protecting myself." Richard stopped, turning toward her, his eyes red, his voice raw. "Do you have any idea what you took from me? From us? Evelyn, we could have had a life." "But we couldn't," she interrupted, her voice rising in anguish. "Don't you see? We would have destroyed everything. Our families, our marriages, and maybe that baby. Maybe it was the price of our sin." The silence that followed was unbearable. What neither of them realized was that Daniel had followed her again. He stood a short distance away, hidden in the shadows of the park, watching his mother sob in Richard's arms. He couldn't hear every word, but he caught enough, the mention of a child, of a secret, of lies buried for decades. The ground beneath him seemed to vanish. His entire life had been built on his father's memory, on the belief that his parents' marriage had been unshakable. And now, this. His mother had cheated. She had loved another man. She had carried his child. Daniel staggered back, his chest heaving. Rage consumed him, but beneath it was something worse. Grief. A grief so heavy it nearly brought him to his knees. The following morning, Richard confronted Margaret. They sat across the dining table, the silence between them sharp as glass. Margaret's face was unreadable, but Richard saw the storm in her eyes. "You went to her," Richard said quietly. "I did," Margaret replied. "And you showed her the photographs." "Yes." Richard exhaled, weary. "You think that will stop us? That it will make me walk away?" Margaret's lips curled into something between a smile and a sneer. "No, but it will make you face the truth. You've lived half your life in shadows, Richard. With me, with her, with yourself. You can't have it both ways anymore. Either you leave her, or you burn everything you've built, your marriage, your reputation, your children's respect." Richard's jaw tightened. "Maybe it's time it all burned, because I won't lose her again." Margaret's eyes flashed with something sharp. Pain, fury, pride. "Then you've already lost me, and perhaps that's what you wanted all along." She rose from the table, her composure unbroken. "I'll give you 1 week, Richard. 1 week to decide what kind of man you are. After that, I'll make the decision for you." Back in her apartment, Evelyn felt the world collapsing. Daniel wasn't answering her calls. Richard was furious, wounded by the truth she had carried alone. Margaret had declared war. She stood at the window, staring at the skyline she had once found so comforting. Now it felt like a cage of glass and steel, pressing in on her. For years she had believed that burying the past would keep everyone safe. But now every secret was rising, each one sharper than the last. And for the first time since Richard had reappeared, Evelyn wondered if their love wasn't destiny at all, if it was a curse. The article broke on a Tuesday morning. Evelyn was making tea when her phone lit up with frantic calls and messages. Her neighbor, her old church friend, even the woman from the flower shop on the corner, each one with a voice full of shock, pity, or thinly veiled judgment. She didn't understand until she opened her laptop. The headline screamed from the city's most notorious gossip site. Prominent attorney Richard Hayes, in affair with widow Evelyn Carter, a love rekindled after decades of secrecy. Beneath it were photographs, grainy but undeniable. Evelyn and Richard in the cafe. Evelyn and Richard walking arm in arm by the Hudson. Evelyn and Richard kissing outside her apartment. Her hand trembled so violently that the tea spilled across the counter. She pressed her palm to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. It was over. The secret was gone. At his office on Park Avenue, Richard stormed into his private chambers, slamming the door shut. His assistant hovered nervously outside, phone ringing off the hook with reporters demanding comment. Margaret's doing. He knew it immediately. She had chosen her moment well. Just days before one of his biggest cases was set to begin, when his public image mattered most. He sank into his chair, his head in his hands. For years he had lived in the balance between two worlds, the man of integrity in public, the man of longing in private. Now the worlds had collided, and there was no hiding left. The door burst open. Daniel. He didn't wait for permission. He stormed across the office, his fury palpable. "You ruined her," Daniel spat. "Do you hear me? You ruined my mother." Richard looked up, weary but unflinching. "No, Daniel, I love your mother." Daniel slammed his fists on the desk. "Love? Don't you dare call it love. Love doesn't destroy families. Love doesn't humiliate women who've already suffered enough. You're a selfish old man clinging to something that should have died decades ago." Richard rose slowly, his eyes hard. "And you're a boy who doesn't understand that sometimes the heart doesn't obey the rules. You think I wanted this? You think I asked to love her all these years? No, but I do, and I always will." Daniel's face twisted with disgust. "Then you're worse than I thought, because you've made her pay for it every day of her life. And now the whole city will make her pay too." Before Richard could answer, Daniel stormed out, the door slamming so hard it rattled the walls. Back at Evelyn's apartment, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. She ignored them all, her body shaking as she sat curled on the couch. The shame was suffocating. Neighbors would whisper, friends would distance themselves. Daniel would never forgive her now. The knock on the door startled her. It was Richard. He stepped inside, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with determination. Without a word, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. She resisted at first, her body stiff, but then she collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest. "They know," she whispered. "Everyone knows. I can't survive this, Richard. I can't." "You will," he said firmly, holding her tighter. "We both will. They can take everything from me, my reputation, my career, even my family, but they can't take you. Not again." "But, Daniel," her voice cracked, "he'll never forgive me. He'll never look at me the same." Richard closed his eyes, his own grief heavy. "Then we fight for him, together. But we don't run, Evelyn, not this time." Across the city, Margaret Hayes sipped her wine with a steady hand as she watched the fallout unfold on television. Reporters swarmed Richard's office. Gossip panels speculated about Evelyn's scandalous betrayal of her late husband's memory. Margaret's phone buzzed with messages from acquaintances offering sympathy, cloaked in curiosity. She felt no joy in the destruction, but she felt vindication. For once, Richard would suffer. For once, Evelyn Carter would know what it meant to live under the weight of humiliation. And yet, as Margaret turned off the TV and stared at her reflection in the darkened window, a strange emptiness gnawed at her. She had won, or so she thought. But why did victory taste so bitter? The next days blurred into chaos. Richard's law firm pressured him to step back from his case. His children called in fury, demanding answers he struggled to give. Evelyn became a prisoner in her own apartment, curtains drawn, phone silenced, the world outside turning hostile. And Daniel finally came, but not with forgiveness. He entered her apartment, his face cold, his words sharper than knives. "You embarrassed me. You embarrassed Dad." "Do you even care what you've done?" Evelyn reached for him desperately. "Daniel, please." "No," he cut her off, stepping back. "You're not the woman I thought you were. I don't even know who you are anymore. And I don't want to." The finality in his voice shattered her. He turned and left, the slam of the door echoing like a coffin lid. Evelyn sank to the floor, her sobs silent this time, too deep for sound. Richard found her hours later, still there, her face pale, her body trembling. He lifted her gently, holding her as though she were the most fragile thing in the world. "Don't let him break you," he whispered. "Don't let any of them break you. We've already paid for our love 1,000 times. We're not paying any more." Evelyn clung to him, torn between despair and the faintest flicker of resolve, because deep down she knew he was right. If this love was to destroy them, then they would face the destruction together. And yet, as the city raged around them, as families fractured and reputations burned, the question lingered, heavier than ever. Would love truly survive the fire, or would it finally turn to ash? The days following the article were suffocating. Evelyn barely left her apartment. The phone calls dwindled, first from friends, then from acquaintances, until there was only silence. In New York, scandals lived fast and died slowly, and she knew her name would echo in whispers for months. But the silence wasn't peace. It was exile. She thought often of her husband, John. What would he think of her now? Would he look at her with the same warmth he once did, or would his eyes harden like Daniel's? The thought kept her awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her chest heavy with shame. Then, one afternoon, Daniel knocked again. This time, his face wasn't just cold. It was weary. Dark circles hung under his eyes, his posture slumped. Evelyn braced herself, expecting more anger. But instead, he dropped a file on her coffee table. "Read it," he said simply. Evelyn frowned, opening the folder. Inside were medical records, decades old. She scanned the pages, confusion building, until her breath caught. It was her own hospital file, from the night she lost the baby. Her eyes widened. "Where did you get this?" Daniel's voice cracked. "I work at the hospital, Mom. I pulled the archives. I needed to know if what I overheard was real, and it was." Her tears spilled. "Daniel?" He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "You should have told me. You should have told him. I was trying to protect everyone," she whispered. Daniel looked up, his eyes red. "Protecting people doesn't mean lying to them. Do you have any idea what this does to me? Knowing I almost had a brother or a sister that I never knew existed, that Dad never knew, that Richard doesn't know the half of it?" Evelyn reached for him. "Daniel, I told him, just days ago." Daniel froze. "You what?" Her voice broke. "I couldn't carry it anymore. I told him the truth, and it shattered him." Daniel leaned back, silent. For the first time she saw not just anger in his eyes, but pain. Deep, raw pain. Finally he whispered, "I hated you for this. I still don't know if I can forgive you, but I don't hate you as much as I hate him." Evelyn's heart ached. "Daniel." "No," he cut her off, rising. "He doesn't get to walk away from this clean, not after ruining you. Not after humiliating our family. He's going to face me again, this time in front of everyone." That night, Richard attended a charity gala, his first public appearance since the scandal broke. Photographers swarmed outside, their flashes relentless, their questions sharp as daggers. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Colleagues avoided his gaze, whispered behind glasses of wine. Margaret was nowhere in sight. She had refused to attend. But Daniel was there. He approached in a storm of quiet fury, ignoring the murmurs around them. When he stopped in front of Richard, the room seemed to hush. "You don't get to hide behind charm anymore," Daniel said, his voice steady but loud enough for others to hear. "You don't get to pretend you're some nobleman in love. You destroyed 2 families. You destroyed my father's memory. And you destroyed my mother's dignity." Richard straightened, his jaw tight. "Daniel—" "No," Daniel snapped. "You want the truth? Here it is. You're a coward, too afraid to leave your wife, too selfish to let my mother live in peace. You've trapped her between shame and longing, and now the whole city knows it." The crowd around them stilled, watching. Richard's face flushed, but his voice was clear. "You think I'm a coward? Maybe I was. For years I lived in shadows, hiding from what I felt, but not anymore. If the world wants me to choose, I choose your mother. In front of everyone here, I choose her." Gasps rippled through the room. Photographers lifted their cameras. Daniel's face hardened. "Then you've chosen her ruin?" And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving Richard standing in the spotlight, the weight of his words echoing across the gala. At home, Margaret watched the news footage. Cameras had captured everything. Daniel's fury, Richard's confession, the shock of the crowd. It was all over the evening broadcasts, the internet ablaze with commentary. Margaret sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap. She had won the battle. Richard's image was shattered, Evelyn's reputation burned. And yet, a hollow ache gnawed at her. Victory had not brought satisfaction, only emptiness. But then a cruel thought settled in her mind. She hadn't yet delivered her final blow. She rose from her chair, opened a drawer, and pulled out an envelope. Inside were more photographs, private investigator shots she hadn't yet released. Richard and Evelyn, not just together in public, but in intimate embraces, proof of the affair in its rawest form. If she released these, there would be no coming back, no hope of reconciliation, no shred of dignity left for either of them. Her hand hovered over the phone, trembling, and then she dialed. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in her apartment watching the same footage, tears streaming down her face. Richard had chosen her, publicly, defiantly, knowing the cost. Her heart ached with love and fear all at once. For decades, she had dreamed of being chosen, and now that it had happened, it felt less like salvation and more like a sentence. Because she knew Margaret wasn't finished, and she knew Daniel's wounds ran too deep. The love that had survived 30 years of silence was now standing on a precipice. One more strike, and it would all collapse. And as Evelyn stared out at the glittering city, her body trembling, She whispered to herself, "We're almost at the end." The photographs hit the internet 2 days later. This time, they weren't grainy images of cafe tables or hotel entrances. They were intimate. Richard's hand on Evelyn's face, his lips pressed to hers, the tenderness of lovers who no longer cared about shadows. The scandal exploded. Headlines screamed betrayal. Networks replayed the images endlessly. Commentators dissected every angle. Evelyn's name, once spoken with quiet respect in her community, was now dragged through the mud. Richard's career, already battered, seemed beyond repair. Evelyn didn't leave her apartment, not even for groceries. She closed the curtains, silenced her phone, and sat in darkness. Shame had become her second skin. Until Richard knocked on her door, he entered quietly, carrying a bag of food. His suit was wrinkled, his face pale, but his eyes were steady. He set the bag on the counter and crossed the room to her. "They won't stop," Evelyn whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "They'll drag us until there's nothing left." Richard knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "Let them. I told you, I'm not hiding anymore. If this is the fire we have to walk through, then we walk it together." Her tears flowed again. "But Daniel, he hates me. He'll never forgive me." Richard's voice softened. "He's your son. He's angry, yes, but anger is just love wounded. One day he'll see you for who you are again. I know it." Evelyn wanted to believe him, but the wound felt too deep. Daniel, meanwhile, was drowning in conflict. He told himself he was done with her, done with both of them. But every night, as he walked the sterile halls of the hospital, he thought of his mother sitting alone in her apartment, her dignity in ashes. And then came the news that Margaret Hayes had filed for divorce, citing adultery in her statement to the press. She named Evelyn explicitly. The scandal, once whispered, was now carved into legal documents. Daniel sat in his office at the hospital, the article glowing on his computer screen. His stomach turned. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was about destruction. Margaret's vengeance was total, and his mother was its easiest victim. He closed his eyes and, for the first time, felt not just anger toward Evelyn, but a flicker of protectiveness. She was still his mother. The next evening, Daniel knocked on her door again. Evelyn opened it slowly, her breath catching when she saw him. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Daniel stepped inside, his shoulders tense. "I'm not here to forgive," he said bluntly. "I'm not there yet. Maybe I never will be. But I won't watch Margaret Hayes tear you apart like this. You don't deserve that. Not after everything you've already suffered." Tears welled in Evelyn's eyes. "Daniel," he held up a hand, "don't thank me. I'm still angry. I'm still hurt. But you're my mother, and I won't abandon you." It wasn't reconciliation, not yet. But it was something, a thread of hope in the rubble. Meanwhile, Richard met Margaret one final time at her request. They sat in the same dining room where so many of their battles had been fought in silence. Margaret looked composed, her navy dress immaculate, but her eyes were weary. "It's over," Richard said quietly. "You've destroyed my career. You've humiliated Evelyn. What more do you want?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "I wanted you to feel what I felt for 30 years, and now you do." Richard nodded slowly. "Then you've succeeded. But here's the truth, Margaret. You'll never break what's between Evelyn and me. Not with articles, not with divorce papers, not with scandal. Because you can't destroy something that survived 30 years of silence." Margaret's composure faltered, just for a moment. Her voice softened. "She was always there, wasn't she? From the beginning, even on our wedding day." Richard's throat tightened. "Yes." Tears glistened in Margaret's eyes, but she blinked them away. She rose, her voice clipped. "Then go to her. But don't think this is some grand victory. You've lost everything, Richard. Everything but her." She left without another word. Weeks passed. The storm slowly began to settle. The headlines moved on to fresher scandals. The whispers quieted, though they never fully disappeared. Richard resigned from his firm, his reputation scarred beyond repair. Evelyn remained in the shadows, her circle of friends smaller, her world quieter. But in the silence, something new began to take root. Richard moved into a modest apartment near Evelyn's. They began sharing dinners, long walks through the park, mornings where the only sound was the clinking of cups and the rustle of newspapers. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was real. Daniel visited occasionally, still distant, still struggling, but no longer absent. Sometimes he sat quietly at the table, watching his mother and Richard together, his expression unreadable. But Evelyn saw the softening in his eyes. The anger hadn't died, but it was no longer the only thing there. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Richard and Evelyn sat on a bench in Central Park, the same place where she had confessed the truth about the lost child. Richard took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "If someone had told me 30 years ago that we'd end up here, I would have laughed, or maybe cried. But here we are." Evelyn leaned against him, her eyes on the horizon. "We've lost so much, and yet we're still here." He kissed her temple softly. "Maybe that's what love really is. Not the fire of youth, but the ashes that refuse to die, no matter how many storms try to bury them." Evelyn closed her eyes, breathing in the quiet, the weight of 3 decades finally lifting. For the first time in years, she felt peace. Whatever the future held, scorn, whispers, or silence, they would face it together, because forbidden or not, their love had survived. Did you enjoy the story? Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Enjoy, and comment below about your experience listening to this story.